You've got a moral compass, right? That little voice inside that tells you what feels right and what feels wrong. But have you ever really stopped to think about where it came from? Because you weren't born with it. It's this personal construction project that starts the moment you arrive, and honestly, it never really stops. So let's trace that story. The story of how your moral compass came to be.
So let's just pause for a second and really think about that. Where does it really come from? Was it your parents? Your friends? Is it some personal philosophy you developed all on your own? The truth is, it's probably a mix of all of those things, and the story of how they all get tangled together is exactly what we're going to unpack.
Okay, so before we start that journey, let's get on the same page about what we're talking about. Morality. It's basically your personal rule book. It's the code of values you use to figure out right from wrong, and it's what guides your actions and your sense of responsibility. You can think of it as the why that directs your inner compass.
All right, let's hit rewind and go all the way back to the very beginning. Our first stop is the world of an infant, a universe that is, well, entirely and simply all about me. This is ground zero. It's the starting point for every single one of us, a moral landscape with only one person living in. Think about it. For a brand new baby, there's no complex ethical debate going on. There's just feeling. The entire universe is filtered through the lens of what feels good, what feels safe, and what they need right now. It's the most fundamental, self-centered perspective we ever have in our entire lives.
So, for an infant, there's no real concept of good or evil, not at all. It's much more basic than that. Right is just a sensation, the feeling of being safe and warm in your mother's arms, or being the center of attention. And wrong? Well, wrong is the discomfort of being hungry or the fear of being left alone. That's it. Your entire moral code is based on these immediate, personal feelings.
But of course, we don't stay in that little me bubble forever, right? The compass has to start pointing outwards at some point. And this next phase is all about learning the rules of the game, soaking up the values from our family, and trying to figure out the complex world of schoolyard justice.
As a kid's world gets bigger, so does their understanding of it. They start to realize, hey, I'm not the only one here with feelings and needs. And they begin to absorb all the values and norms of their family, which creates the very first external layer on their developing moral compass.
And here's how that starts to look. You see the first signs of sharing. You see them internalizing family values. This is just how we do things in our family kind of stuff. And of course, you get that classic kid logic. Hey, it's not wrong if I don't get caught. But, and this is crucial, they also start to get that rules are there to help everyone get along. Usually through simple deals like, okay, if you do this, you'll get that.
And this quote is just a perfect little window into this whole process. A 5-year-old kid like Samarth isn't just zoning out in front of a cartoon. He's actually using it like a case study. He's actively trying to figure out the why behind what's right and wrong. This is moral reasoning in action, and honestly, it's a huge developmental leap.
Okay, so now we're moving on to the next big stage, and for a lot of parents and teenagers, this one is probably the most dramatic. This is the age of the peer, a time when that moral compass can feel like it's spinning completely out of control, all because a powerful new magnet has entered the room. And this right here shows you exactly what's going on. It's this massive shift in influence. See, in childhood, that moral compass is mostly calibrated by family and other adults. But then adolescence hits, and boom, a new magnetic north appears, the peer group. And why does this happen so powerfully? Well, it's a huge part of figuring out who you are, of trying to find a place to belong outside of your family. And all of a sudden, what your friends think can feel more important than anything else in the world.
So the bottom line is that for a teenager, right and wrong often become whatever their friends say it is. The peer group becomes the new rule book, the new authority on values. And that's why they spend so much time together. It's not just about hanging out, it's about constantly reinforcing that shared moral code, a code that can sometimes completely replace the one their parents gave them. So after navigating the really intense social world of peer pressure, the journey takes its next crucial turn. The focus starts to shift away from just fitting in with other people and moves toward forging a moral code that is truly and personally your own.
This is the stage where you start asking the really big questions. It's not enough anymore to just go along with the rules from your family or your friends. You begin this very conscious process of building your own identity and figuring out, okay, what do I actually believe in a way that makes sense to me deep down?
And this leads to a moral framework that's way more sophisticated. You start to understand that morality isn't one size fits all, You realize that different people in different cultures have totally different values. Your judgments start to be based less on specific rules and more on these bigger, more abstract principles, like justice, or fairness, or compassion.
So if we boil this whole journey down, it kind of looks like this. First, it starts with the self, where right and wrong is all about how you feel. Then it moves to others, where you get your rules from family and friends. And finally, hopefully, it arrives at principles, where your morality is guided by your own personal, abstract code of ethics.
Now, of course, it's really important to remember that this is kind of the ideal path. Life can be messy. And negative experiences, things like trauma or abuse, can seriously throw a wrench in this whole process. They can make it incredibly difficult for someone to learn to trust others and build that clear, stable moral compass that we all really need.
And that brings us to our final question, something to really chew on. We trace this whole journey from being a baby all the way to having a principled code. But does it ever really stop? As we go through life and meet new people, encounter new ideas, face new challenges, does our moral compass ever truly stop recalibrating? It's something to think about.
Have you ever stopped to think about how kids actually learn the difference between right and wrong? I mean, yeah, we send them to school to learn math and history, but what if one of the biggest lessons they're learning is how to build their own moral compass? So let's dive in and talk about how our classrooms are really shaping the character of the next generation. Okay, get this. This quote, it's from a real conversation a researcher had with their own 6-year-old daughter. Think about that for a second. This little kid has already figured out that even though lying is wrong, telling the truth in her classroom might not be the smartest move. This one story just cuts right to the heart of the challenge we're talking about today. And that really brings us to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? It's a puzzle that parents and teachers deal with all the time. Why is it that kids can often tell you exactly what the right thing to do is, but then, when the moment comes, they choose to do the wrong thing? What's going on in that space between knowing what's right and actually doing it? Well, this isn't just a random thing. It's actually a well-known challenge, and it's called the knowing-doing gap. It's that space between what we call moral literacy, knowing the rules, and actual moral behavior, what you do in the real world. The problem usually isn't that kids don't know the values, it's that they have a really hard time putting those values into action when it counts. So you can kind of break it down into two types of morality that kids are learning at the exact same time. On one hand, you've got theoretical morality. This is the official stuff, right? What they hear in assemblies, what's on the posters. But then there's practical morality, and that's all about what actually works in a given situation, like telling a little lie to avoid getting a lecture about forgotten homework. One is about what society expects, and the other is just about what's convenient or what keeps you out of trouble. So how do we bridge that gap? To get a child to go from just knowing the right thing to actually doing the right thing, we need to understand what makes their moral engine run. You can think of it like an engine with 4 crucial parts. And if even one of those parts isn't working right, the whole system just stalls out. It basically works like a 4-step process. It all has to happen in order. First, you need moral sensitivity. That's just noticing that there's a moral issue at play. Then comes moral judgment, which is figuring out the right thing to do. After that, a kid needs moral motivation. They have to actually want to do the right thing. And finally, moral action is having the skills to follow through. All 4 have to fire, one after the other.
So if we look a little closer, sensitivity is about the school environment helping a kid's radar for moral issues get stronger. Judgment is about giving them real dilemmas to think through. Motivation is about making them feel like being a good person is actually cool and worthwhile. And action is about teaching them the practical skills, like how to say you're sorry or how to solve a fight without yelling. Okay, so we've got the theory down, but how can schools and teachers actually get in there and tune all 4 parts of that moral engine? Let's take a look at the practical toolkit they can use right there in the classroom. Every single school has 2 curriculums. First is the explicit one. That's the stuff that's openly taught, the posters on the wall, the stories in assembly. But then there's the hidden curriculum, and honestly, it's way more powerful. It's the school's culture. It's how teachers behave, how rules are enforced, whether students get a say in anything. And here's the kicker. If the hidden curriculum doesn't match the explicit one, kids will always learn from what they see, not from what they're told. So what does that look like in the real world? It's way more than just telling nice stories. It's about having teachers who actually lead by example with their own behavior. It's about creating a classroom culture that's built on acceptance. And it's about giving students real responsibilities, a real voice in how the school is run. You see, those actions speak so much louder than any poster ever could. And really, at the foundation of all of this is one crucial thing:
an empathetic attitude from the teacher. What does that mean? It means creating a culture of acceptance, not rejection. It's about making a space that feels safe enough for a child to share what they think, even to admit their mistakes, without being afraid of getting shut down. Because without that feeling of safety, a kid is never going to move beyond that practical morality of just trying to stay out of trouble. As we start to wrap this up, it's so important to remember that as big a role as schools play, they aren't working in a vacuum. Building a child's character, it's really a team sport. The school is just one of the key players on the field. At the end of the day, raising a morally strong generation is a partnership. It just is. The values that are taught in the classroom can only really take root if they're being backed up at home, by the family, and by our society as a whole. It's a process that needs all of us to be focused on it, starting from a really early age. So that leaves us with one last really big question to think about. How can we, all of us, as parents, as teachers, as a community, how can we build environments for our kids where doing the right thing also happens to be the easiest thing to do? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.
Hey there, and welcome. Have you ever gotten into an argument about what's right or wrong, and it feels like you're just speaking completely different languages? Well, you might not be far off. Today, we're going to dig into a really cool framework that helps explain the why behind our moral choices.
I mean, it's a massive question, isn't it? If being a good person was simple, we'd all have the same answer sheet, but we don't. So to see what I mean, let's look at a few quick examples.
All right, first up, meet Samarth. For a 3-year-old, the world is pretty straightforward. If his cousin gets 5 sweets, he needs to get 5 sweets. That's it. It's not about who's older or who behaved better. It's just pure, simple, one-for-one equality. Anything else is just not fair.
Okay, now let's think about Lavanya. At 7, her moral compass is all about the rules set by others. If mom says so, if the teacher says so, then that's what's right, period. For her, being good means playing by the book and fitting into the social code she's being taught. No questions asked. And finally, here's Rishabh. He's got a real dilemma. A big presentation at work, or a person who needs help after an accident. He chooses to help, basically deciding that a bigger, more universal principle, the value of a human life, is way more important than a professional duty. He gets that sometimes you gotta break a smaller rule for a much higher good.
So, you see, Samarth, Lavanya, and Rishabh aren't just disagreeing. They're using completely different moral software to come to their conclusions. And this exact puzzle is what got psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg so fascinated.
And this gets us to the key idea here, moral reasoning. Kohlberg had this breakthrough where he realized the important thing wasn't whether people said yes or no to a moral problem. He wanted to know why. The justification, the logic behind the choice. That's where he found the real pattern.
So, here's our plan. We'll start with the classic moral puzzle. Then we'll walk through Kohlberg's 3 big levels of reasoning: the rules of me, the rules of we, and the rules beyond. And then we'll wrap up by connecting it all back to ourselves. Ready?
All right, let's dive right into the thing that started it all. To really get his theory, Kohlberg would tell people stories, these tricky situations with no easy answer. And the most famous one of all is what's known as the Heinz dilemma. So take a second to let that sink in. It's a tough one. The big question is, should Heinz have stolen the drug? Now, remember, your gut reaction, that immediate yes or no, isn't the point. What really matters is the reason why you think that. That's the key to all of this.
Kohlberg took all the different answers and justifications he got and sorted them into these 3 main levels of moral development. Just think of them as 3 different ways of looking at Heinz's problem. Let's start at the beginning, with level 1. This first level is called pre-conventional morality, and at its core, it's all about one thing: self-interest. It boils down to direct consequences for the person making the choice. The main questions here are pretty simple. Am I going to get in trouble? And what's in it for me?
You can see just how basic the thinking is here. Stage 1 is all about avoiding punishment, like little Samarth not wanting to get a timeout. And stage 2 is about getting a reward, kind of like a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of deal.
Okay, so let's put it into practice. If you're using this very self-focused, rules-of-me logic, how does Heinz's really complicated problem look?
See how you can get to both yes and no from here? The first answer is totally focused on avoiding punishment, going to jail. The other is focused on the personal reward, the happiness Heinz gets from saving his wife. The reasoning isn't really about right and wrong in a bigger sense. It's all about the direct outcome for Heinz himself.
Okay, time to level up. Let's move on to level 2,
conventional morality. Now the focus zooms out from just me to we. What will other people think of me? What does the law actually say? Keeping society running smoothly becomes the top priority.
So in stage 3, it's all about social approval. You do the right thing because you want to be seen as a good boy or a nice girl. That's Lavanya, right? Following the rules to fit in. Then stage 4 gets a little bigger. It's about obeying the actual laws and respecting authority because, hey, that's what keeps society from falling apart. So with this new social perspective in mind, how does the justification for what Hines did or didn't do change?
And again, you can argue it both ways. The argument for stealing is based on a social role. A good husband is supposed to protect his wife. But the argument against stealing is that the law is the law. If people start breaking rules, society will descend into chaos. So it's a conflict between your social role and the social order.
And that brings us to the final and most complex level, post-conventional morality. This is where things get really abstract. A person at this level is thinking beyond what their friends think and even beyond what the law says, to consider universal principles, things like justice, human rights, and deep personal ethics.
At stage 5, people see laws as a kind of social contract, basically rules we all agree to for the common good. But they also recognize that these rules can be flawed or unfair and can be questioned. Stage 6 is the highest level Kohlberg identified, where decisions are guided by your own deeply held universal ethical principles, like the idea that human life is sacred, which are seen as being more important than any specific law.
So looking through this final, most complex lens, what's the justification for Hines' choice?
At this level, the answer becomes much clearer and almost always lands on one side. The reasoning is that the law protecting property is in direct conflict with a higher universal principle, preserving a human life. And in that battle, the right to life wins. This is exactly Rishabh's logic, right? He broke his commitment at work because helping someone in need was a higher moral calling.
Whew. Okay, we have covered a ton of ground. So let's pull it all together and see what this framework really tells us about how our own moral compass works.
This chart really just says it all, doesn't it? Level 1 is all about me. What's going to happen to me? Level 2 expands to others and the rules of society. And level 3 goes beyond all of that to ask about universal justice. It's a really clear journey from a self-centered view to a social one, and finally to a principled one.
So look, the most important takeaway here is that this isn't about judging people as good or bad. It's a tool, a framework for understanding why we disagree on big moral questions. It helps us see that when we argue with someone, maybe it's not about our core values, but about the very level of reasoning we're using. It gives us a language to understand each other and even to reflect on our own moral growth.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Kohlberg pretty much saw these stages as a ladder you climb as you mature. But maybe it's more like a toolkit, and as we grow, we learn to use different moral tools depending on the situation. What do you think? Thanks so much for tuning in.